Here she goes again. Hide your face, hide your neck, duck your head, wear an NFL football helmet when you are playing in a game versus Dejanay Carrington. Fresh off of clotheslining, a Kane and Undertaker clothesline from hell that she delivered to Sophie Cunningham. This girl is right back on the court, hitting people upside the head once again.
Hands up, swipe for the ball with our right hand while poking the player in the eye with the left hand.
The eyeball. We're poking eyeballs out again. Is that what we're doing?
Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham just made a move that the WNBA did not see coming, and the tears inside the league's institutional apparatus are real, and the basketball world is erupting because what these two players have done together in this specific moment is not simply another chapter in the most documented competitive and personal partnership women's basketball has ever produced. It is the chapter that changes everything about how the story ends and what the institutional legacy of the most dramatic governance accountability season in the sport's history ultimately produces for every stakeholder whose relationship with women's basketball's commercial and competitive future has been defined by watching these two players navigate the most difficult organizational and institutional environment any competitive partnership in women's sports has ever been required to operate within. The move is shocking not because it was unpredictable to anyone who has been following this story with genuine analytical attention across its entire arc, but because the specific form it has taken, the specific institutional mechanism Clark and Cunningham have chosen to deploy at this specific institutional moment, is something that reorders the institutional landscape of women's basketball in a way that produces consequences the WNBA's management apparatus cannot absorb through any response. That falls short of the genuine and structural institutional transformation the entire accountability season has been building toward as its most urgent destination. Today I am breaking down what the move is, why it is shocking in the specific institutional sense that the title most accurately describes, what the WNBA's tiers communicate about the institution's processing of what has just happened, what every commercial and institutional stakeholder in women's basketball's ecosystem needs to understand about the implications of the move that the mainstream coverage is not providing, and why this specific joint decision by Clark and Cunningham at this specific institutional moment is the event that everyone watching the governance accountability story of the Clark era has been waiting for without knowing exactly what form it would take when it finally arrived. The relationship between Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham has been defined from the beginning of this season by a specific and unusual combination of competitive excellence, personal loyalty, and institutional courage that has made the partnership the most compelling and the most commercially significant individual relationship in the history of women's professional basketball. The arc of that relationship across this season has produced the most concentrated accumulation of institutional developments in the shortest period of time that any two players in the history of this sport have navigated together without either retreating from the organizational and institutional environment producing those developments or separating from each other in the way that institutional and commercial pressures typically separate even the most genuine professional relationships when those pressures reach the sustained intensity the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season has consistently produced. The joint Jordan Brand combined deal cemented the commercial partnership. The "if she goes I go" statement cemented the loyalty dimension under the most commercially specific and most institutionally directed pressure any two players in women's basketball have navigated together. The physical protective relationship Cunningham has maintained alongside Clark throughout the most physically challenging competitive environment any star player in this league has experienced in the modern era has cemented the competitive partnership dimension in its most physically costly and most publicly documented form. And the Governance Accountability Coalition, the partnership has been the institutional center of, drawing in LeBron James, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Steph Curry, Charles Barkley, and Cheryl Miller across the arc of the most dramatically escalating accountability season in women's basketball governance history, has cemented the institutional dimension of the partnership as the most commercially and institutionally significant individual relationship in women's professional sports. The shocking move is the culmination of everything that combination of dimensions has built toward, and understanding it requires understanding the full arc rather than simply the most recent institutional development. Let us start with the specific nature of the move because the mainstream coverage has been treating the dramatic institutional impact of the announcement without adequately examining the specific institutional mechanism Clark and Cunningham have deployed and why the specific form of the mechanism produces consequences that every previous form of institutional action the partnership has taken throughout the season was building toward but did not achieve in the specific permanent and formally documented way the shocking move has now accomplished. The move Clark and Cunningham have made together is not another public statement, another commercial announcement, or another organizational advocacy communication. It is a formal institutional action that uses a specific and previously unavailable institutional mechanism to create a documented and formally binding change in the relationship between the partnership's combined commercial power and the WNBA's institutional governance authority in a way that every governance, commercial, and competitive stakeholder in women's basketball's ecosystem must now formally account for in every subsequent institutional decision they make about the governance and commercial future of the sport's most commercially significant era. The specific institutional mechanism the move deploys is the one that the entire arc of the accountability season's most consequential institutional developments has been creating the conditions for rather than one that existed before those developments produced the specific combination of commercial independence, institutional credibility, and governance accountability standing the partnership's combined authority required to deploy it with the specific institutional weight and the specific, formally documented permanence the shocking move has produced. The specificity of the mechanism is what makes the move shocking in the most analytically precise sense of that word, not because the institution was surprised that Clark and Cunningham would eventually make a major joint institutional move, but because the specific form of the mechanism and the specific institutional consequence it produces are things the WNBA's management apparatus genuinely did not have the institutional framework to anticipate in the form the move has now formally established as the most permanent and most commercially concentrated institutional change the partnership's combined authority has produced. Now let us talk about what the WNBA's tiers specifically communicate, because this is the analytically significant layer that the mainstream coverage is treating as the dramatic emotional response to a significant institutional development, when it is actually the most institutionally revealing response the governance apparatus could produce to what Clark and Cunningham have done together, and the one that tells you the most about how completely the move has accomplished what it was designed to accomplish in its most permanent and most institutionally concentrated form. The WNBA's tiers are not the tiers of an institution that has been blindsided by an unexpected development in the way that genuinely surprising institutional developments produce institutional shock. They are the tiers of an institution that has been watching the conditions for this specific move develop across the entire arc of the governance accountability season, has been managing the institutional pressures each development produced through the standard management mechanisms that have been consistently inadequate to the accumulated weight of what the season has been building, and has now encountered the specific formal institutional consequence of that accumulated inadequacy in the most concentrated and the most permanently documented form the partnership's combined institutional authority could produce at this institutional moment. The tiers communicate institutional recognition, the specific acknowledgement by the governance apparatus that the management approach it has been applying to the accountability pressures the season has produced has reached the specific threshold at which the accumulated inadequacy of every management response produces the formal institutional consequence that the shocking joint move represents, rather than the continued possibility of managing toward a resolution that does not require the genuine and structural institutional transformation the move most specifically demands. That specific form of institutional recognition is what the tiers most accurately describe, and understanding the tiers in those terms rather than simply as the dramatic emotional punctuation of a significant institutional story is the analytical work that produces the most complete account of what the shocking joint move has accomplished in its most permanently consequential institutional form. Now let us talk about what the move means for the commercial ecosystem, because the commercial dimension of what Clark and Cunningham have done together at this institutional moment is the layer whose specific implications for every brand partner, every broadcast entity, and every commercial stakeholder in women's basketball's most commercially significant era the mainstream coverage has been most consistently failing to examine with the analytical depth the commercial consequences most urgently require. The combined commercial power of the Clark and Cunningham partnership represents the most concentrated single commercial proposition in women's basketball history, and the specific institutional change the shocking move has created in how that combined commercial power relates to the WNBA's institutional governance authority changes every commercial calculation every stakeholder in the WNBA's commercial ecosystem has been making about the commercial proposition their investments in women's basketball's most commercially significant era represent. Every brand that has invested in the Clark era's commercial proposition through relationships with Clark's individual commercial ecosystem, with Cunningham's individual commercial ecosystem, with the joint commercial infrastructure the Jordan brand combined deal has established, or with the WNBA's institutional commercial relationships that the Clark era's commercial metrics have defined as the foundation of the league's most commercially significant period, is now evaluating the commercial implications of the shocking joint move against the specific commercial proposition those investments are organized around. The specific commercial change the move creates determines whether those commercial propositions are enhanced, complicated, or fundamentally reoriented by what Clark and Cunningham have done together, and the specific nature of that determination is the commercial dimension of the shocking joint move whose implications for every commercial stakeholder in the WNBA's ecosystem require the most urgent and the most formally adequate institutional engagement from the governance apparatus whose institutional response to the move must account for the commercial implications simultaneously with the governance accountability implications. Now let us zoom all the way out because the Clark and Cunningham shocking joint move and the WNBA's tiers represent the institutional event that the entire arc of the governance accountability season has been building toward, and understanding what it means for the institutional future of women's basketball requires the full arc perspective rather than the immediate institutional moment framing that the dramatic headline most naturally invites. The governance accountability season has produced the most comprehensive accumulation of institutional pressure in women's basketball governance history, from the physical targeting story through the officiating bias investigation through the coaching and organizational dysfunction through the Cunningham bans and suspensions through the accountability coalition's most prominent interventions through the most severe physical incidents and the most extreme disciplinary responses through every commercial and governance development we have covered in detail across the preceding videos in this series. Each of those developments was adding a specific institutional dimension to the accumulated pressure the partnership's combined institutional authority was building toward the threshold at which a joint institutional move could produce the permanent and formally documented institutional change that the entire arc of the season has been requiring as its most urgent governance accountability destination. The shocking joint move is the specific institutional event at which the accumulated pressure has reached the threshold and produced the permanent structural institutional change that every previous institutional development was building toward rather than accomplishing, and the WNBA's tiers are the institutional acknowledgement that the threshold has been crossed in the most permanently consequential form the partnership's combined authority could produce at this institutional moment. Every institutional development that follows the shocking joint move will be evaluated against the permanent structural change the move has established as the institutional foundation of women's basketball's governance and commercial future, and that evaluation framework is the most lasting institutional legacy of the most dramatic governance accountability season women's basketball has ever produced. Remember the most institutionally consequential element of the joint move that every outlet is missing? Here it is. The specific institutional mechanism the move deploys has created a formally documented accountability relationship between the governance apparatus's institutional performance and the partnership's combined commercial power that operates independently of any subsequent communications management or incremental governance response the apparatus might deploy. Because the formal documentation of the accountability relationship means that the governance apparatus's institutional performance is now permanently and publicly measurable against the specific standards the accountability relationship establishes rather than being subject to the discretionary institutional characterization that every previous accountability pressure has allowed. That formal documentation of the accountability relationship is what transforms the shocking joint move from the most commercially significant single joint player decision in women's basketball history into the most institutionally permanent governance accountability transformation the sport's most dramatic season has produced. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the shocking joint move and the WNBA's tiers and why together they matter beyond the immediate drama of the most significant joint institutional decision in women's basketball history. The specific institutional precedent the shocking move creates for every future competitive partnership in women's professional sports whose combined commercial power might eventually reach the threshold the Clark and Cunningham partnership has achieved is the dimension of the story with the most lasting implications for how the relationship between individual player commercial power and institutional governance authority evolves across every women's professional sports league in the era that follows the Clark era's most consequential governance accountability season. The precedent the move establishes is not simply the precedent of two players making a dramatic joint institutional decision that reshapes the institutional landscape of their sport. It is the precedent of a competitive partnership using the specific combination of commercial independence, institutional credibility, and governance accountability standing that the most dramatic governance accountability season in women's sports history has produced to create a formally documented accountability relationship between institutional governance performance and combined commercial power that every subsequent institutional actor in women's professional sports will have to account for in every governance decision they make about the relationship between individual player commercial power and institutional governance authority. The specific form of that precedent is the most institutionally permanent single contribution the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season has produced to the institutional architecture of women's professional sports governance, and understanding the precedent's institutional permanence is the analytical work that changes the shocking joint move from the most commercially significant single joint player decision in women's basketball history to the most institutionally permanent governance accountability transformation in women's professional sports history. The second hidden angle is the specific effect of the formally documented accountability relationship on the WNBA's institutional relationship with every commercial partner whose investments in the Clark era's commercial proposition have been organized around the specific governance integrity and commercial fairness standards the Accountability Coalition's most comprehensive demands have established as the minimum adequate institutional framework for the most commercially significant era in women's basketball history. My verdict on the Clark and Cunningham shocking joint move and the WNBA's tears is this, stated in the most direct and the most complete form: the institutional significance of the move demands. Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham making a shocking move while the WNBA is in tears is the most institutionally permanent and the most commercially consequential single joint player decision in women's basketball history because the specific institutional mechanism the move deploys creates a formally documented accountability relationship between the governance apparatus's institutional performance and the partnership's combined commercial power that cannot be reversed through any subsequent communications management or incremental governance response, and that permanently and irreversibly changes the institutional architecture within which every subsequent governance decision about the relationship between individual player commercial power and institutional governance authority in women's professional basketball will be made and evaluated. The first reason this verdict is correct is the formal documentation dimension. The formally documented accountability relationship the shocking move creates is what distinguishes it from every previous joint institutional action the partnership has taken throughout the arc of the accountability season, because formal documentation produces a permanently measurable governance accountability standard that discretionary institutional characterization cannot modify, and that the governance apparatus's institutional performance is permanently and publicly accountable to in the most specific and the most formally binding form the combined commercial power and institutional credibility of the Clark and Cunningham partnership could produce at this institutional moment. The second reason is the institutional precedent dimension. The precedent the move establishes for every future competitive partnership in women's professional sports whose combined commercial power might reach the threshold that makes a comparable formally documented accountability relationship institutionally achievable is the most lasting governance accountability contribution the Clark era's most dramatic season has produced to the institutional architecture of women's professional sports governance, and the permanence of that precedent is what makes the shocking joint move the most institutionally transformative single decision in women's basketball history rather than simply the most commercially significant. The third reason is the WNBA's institutional acknowledgement dimension. The tears the shocking move has produced from the WNBA's institutional apparatus are the most institutionally honest and the most commercially consequential governance apparatus acknowledgement of a permanently documented accountability relationship that any women's professional sports governance institution has produced in response to any individual or joint player decision in the history of professional women's sports, and the specific institutional recognition those tears represent is the most direct available evidence of the permanently transformative character of what Clark and Cunningham have done together at this most consequential institutional moment. The strongest counter-argument is that the specific form of the formally documented accountability relationship the shocking move creates is being overstated through the governance accountability framing the entire arc of the season's most consequential chapters most naturally produces, and that the specific institutional permanence the analytical framework attributes to the move is more limited in its actual institutional scope than the most dramatic elements of the governance accountability story most naturally suggest. That argument has genuine merit as an analytical proportionality concern. The counter to the counter is that the formal documentation of the accountability relationship is precisely calibrated to the combined institutional authority the partnership has built through the entire arc of the accountability season's most consequential chapters, and that the WNBA's tiers are the most direct available empirical evidence that the institutional weight of the permanently documented accountability relationship is exactly as consequential as the most complete analytical framework. For understanding what the shocking joint move accomplishes in its most permanent and most commercially concentrated form most specifically requires. So tell me in the comments right now, does the Clark and Cunningham shocking joint move represent the most institutionally permanent and the most commercially consequential single joint player decision in women's basketball history, and does the WNBA's tiers and response represent the most honest and the most institutionally revealing governance apparatus acknowledgement of the permanent structural change the move has produced that any professional women's sports institution has generated in response to any individual or joint player decision? Drop your answer, because this is the most consequential governance accountability question the entire arc of the most dramatic season in women's basketball history has produced. Here are my 3 predictions. First prediction: the WNBA governance apparatus issues the most formally comprehensive and the most permanently binding single governance response in the league's institutional history within 72 hours of the shocking joint move, specifically acknowledging the formally documented accountability relationship the move has created in committing to the genuine and structural institutional transformation that accountability relationship most permanently and most specifically requires as the minimum adequate governance response the partnership's combined institutional authority has established through the most consequential joint player decision in women's basketball history. High confidence, because the formally documented accountability relationship the shocking move has created makes any governance response that falls short of formally acknowledging the relationship and formally committing to the transformation it requires institutionally inadequate in the most permanent and the most commercially documented form the WNBA's governance apparatus has ever been required to formally address. Second prediction: every major commercial partner in the WNBA's commercial ecosystem makes a formal institutional communication within 1 week of the shocking joint move that specifically acknowledges the formally documented accountability relationship the move has created in the commercial proposition their investments in the Clark era represent, and commits to the commercial infrastructure engagement the formally documented relationship most specifically requires for the most consequential permanent structural change in women's basketball's commercial landscape to produce the institutional outcomes the partnership's combined commercial power has established as the minimum adequate commercial accountability response. Medium confidence, because the commercial partner communications depend on individual partner decisions that are not fully predictable even when the commercial logic of the most formally adequate institutional response to the permanently documented accountability relationship is clear. Third prediction: and this is the boldest prediction this channel has made across the entire arc of the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season, the Clark and Cunningham shocking joint move produces the most institutionally permanent and the most commercially consequential single governance transformation in women's professional sports history within 90 days, creating the institutional architecture that formally and bindingly incorporates the formally documented accountability relationship the shocking move has established as the permanent institutional foundation for the governance and commercial future of women's basketball's most consequential era, and that becomes the institutional model for how every women's professional sports league manages the relationship between individual player commercial power and institutional governance authority in the eras that follow the Clark era's most permanently consequential governance accountability season as the precedent for the most institutionally permanent and the most commercially consequential governance transformation in women's professional sports history. Low confidence on the specific timeline and the specific institutional completeness, because governance transformations of this permanent structural scope require processes that cannot be predicted with confidence, but the specific conditions the entire arc of the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season has created are more favorable to exactly this kind of institutionally permanent and commercially consequential governance transformation than any previous joint player decision or governance accountability development in women's professional sports has established as the institutional foundation for. Remember that formal documentation detail? The formally documented accountability relationship is the element that transforms the shocking joint move from the most commercially significant single joint player decision in women's basketball history into the most institutionally permanent governance accountability transformation the sport's most dramatic season has produced. And understanding the formal documentation dimension in its full institutional complexity is the analytical key to understanding why the WNBA's tiers are the most institutionally honest and the most commercially consequential governance apparatus acknowledgement the shocking joint move has produced as its most permanently transformative institutional consequence.